Well, a new year, a new administration, and a new chapter in the fight against COVID-19. I caught up with one of the UAE's top diplomats and asked him about the future of the Middle East. I want to kick off by asking you to just walk us through the Abraham Accords up to this point. Was there anything about this whole process that was surprising to you and how it's all played out thus far?
Yeah, I think it was incredibly surprising that something like this could have been pulled off. And I take my figurative hat off to the Trump administration, and in particular Jared Kushner, for having been able to achieve something that none of us really thought could be was possible. The idea that we would actually sign a peace treaty with Israel, given the decades of anti-Israeli and anti-Semitic rhetoric that we've heard in the region. And after there was a presentation that Jared Kushner had made on the economic plan.
We were there.
In Bahrain. And it was fascinating, but it seemed at the time...
The skepticism was still there.
Oh, there was a tremendous amount of skepticism. And it was almost like, a startup presentation. Fantastic and really, really youthful, but somehow disconnected. And yet... he clearly tapped into something very, very important. He and the Trump administration understood that the time was right for change. And if you could figure out how to put the parties together, almost relentlessly pushing for understanding, then they managed to pull it off and did something that nobody else has managed. It would be interesting to think how many other American presidents could have been able to do that, but chose not to because they didn't believe that necessarily anything would come of it.
We have a situation where a new administration is coming in, the Biden administration.
Sure.
They've been very clear about their hopes for rapprochement with Iran. And frankly, the UAE and the other Gulf countries, seemingly now with the Abraham Accords, are developing a new security relationship with Israel.
Yeah.
How big an influence do you think that has had or will have on what this region looks like in the future?
Well, for the most part, we've been looking at the relationship not necessarily through a security angle, more as in terms of economies joining together. Israeli economy is particularly well connected globally, and so is the Emirati economy. I think COVID has had an effect in that we've really had to look at what's our competitive edge and how we can take this economy forward. It's much more of an internal look as opposed to a geopolitical look, or a geopolitical stance, I'd say. The interest in...
So this idea of this sort of anti-Iran nexus that's being built, is that a false narrative?
No, I don't think it's a false narrative, but I think that maybe there's excessive emphasis just on that aspect. And I think we don't have a problem with rapprochement with Iran. What it needs to be, it needs to be conditional. It needs to be participatory. We need to be able to engage also with the Biden administration, with the Iranians, with the region, so that because we're all implicated in these questions. And I think that's what that was the problem with the JCPOA initially, in that it didn't take our concerns into account, and it treated us as bystanders and spectators when we felt that it was directly concerned with our security. So rapprochement with Iran, absolutely. We do business with Iran. We've got a significant Iranian population here. We don't have an issue with that. We do have an issue with, as you and your viewers know, ballistic missiles, nuclear technology, looking at a nuclear weapon, and the corrosive influence that they have on many Arab economies. So if we can put an end to all of that, fantastic. Everybody would be very happy to deal with Iran and on an equal basis.
Does the Abraham Accords and that new relationship with Israel mean, do you think, that as a combined force, you will have a seat at that table? Your voices will be heard?
I think it's kind of a low-hanging fruit to use our relationship with Israel to present a more unified position across the region in terms of what happens with Iran. We do have common interests. It's clear, because we stand on the side of stopping nuclear proliferation in the region, and we stand on the side of developing local economies and developing our human resources. So in that sense, we stand on the same side. How the Biden administration will take that into account is something that we all need to work on. I don't think it's a secret to the Biden appointees or future appointees that this is the way we look at the region. And I think it's the ex-U.S. ambassador to the UAE, Barbara Leaf, I believe, who is going to be playing a key role in the Biden administration on the region. She knows our concerns very well, and we would expect that those concerns to be taken into account. We in the Emirates are a positive influence. The Gulf states are a positive influence, and it's our belief that the Biden administration and the group of nations that have been negotiating with Iran take us on board and see the positive influence that we can bring to discussions on Iran.
Was maximum pressure, in your view, successful?
I think we are still in favor of maximum pressure. Yeah, absolutely. Was it successful? We think it'll succeed.
If it's continued into the new administration?
It's continued, yes.
A lot of questions have been raised in the last couple of weeks about the future of democracy after what we saw in the United States on Capitol Hill. Are you concerned that we as the United States don't seem to have a handle on the policies that we are trying to project in terms of democratic values?
That's a very interesting question. I was asked that question in early 2017 when I was in the U.S. I was speaking on National Public Radio, and it just occurred to me that actually democracy is a contest. It's a continual contest, and because you have the different branches of government, because you have civil society, because you have laws in the courts, because you have public opinion, you're always going to get some kind of turmoil. Does it end up in being a failed state? No, I don't think so. What I find interesting, fascinating, is all of the legal questions that are thrown up by this, all of the constitutional questions. How much power does a president really have? If he doesn't want to cooperate with the other branches of government, what can you do? And I spent a bit of time reading up on earlier presidents, and it seems that the concept of the presidency is actually it's an expanding one at times and a contracting one at times, and it depends very much on the personality involved and the readiness to uphold values or to uphold kind of a transactional approach. Both seem to work. What's happened in the last few days, obviously, is it's quite distressing to see that, because you're always looking to the United States as a source for global stability. But at the same time, I think those who've looked at the United States, spent time there, studied the United States, we understand that actually it's a very vibrant and strong kind of body that can take these kinds of blows.
How would you gauge the level of threat that political Islam represents today?
I think it's much less of a threat, and I think partly because what political Islam did was
overplay their hand?
They certainly overplayed their hand, and I don't think that they really... they had access to emotion, but they didn't have plans for what to do with an economy or a society. And I think you saw Muslim Brotherhood parliaments were focused on really peripheral issues not related to well-being and economic growth and sort of the security. Well, you need a solid economy in order to provide security to your people. So in that sense, there was a lack of imagination, a lack of interest in actually constructing a society. There was a lot of interest in instructing a society, right? I think what we did in the Gulf states was take the opportunity to begin to look at younger Gulf Arabs' aspirations. And aspirations is an idea that is quite new to the region. In the past, traditionally, we would say, look, you've got a job, it's a government job, you don't really need to have any personal fulfillment. Now, personal fulfillment is seen as an objective, a resource, a way of motivating young men and women to get out there and build their careers.
So making the demographics essentially work for the region.
Yeah, absolutely.
As opposed to against it.
Yeah, and there was a time when the UNDP reports came out on the Arab world where there was this big threat of 100 million Arabs coming onto the job market. And particularly in the Emirates, we thought of the young Emiratis not as a threat, but as an opportunity. And so government has really moved. I mean, under the leadership of Sheikh Mohammed bin Rashid, ruler of Dubai, the leadership of the government has taken an approach to enable young men and women, to enable them in every possible way, through education, through health, through the way we've dealt with COVID, but also in terms of legal and financial infrastructure, to empower them, to allow them to begin to sort of set up businesses and figure out how to solve problems locally and globally. So that is actually very exciting as a model for the Arab world. And we would encourage other Arab states to look at what we're doing.
When you think about this with regards to the sort of bigger picture for the Gulf Arab countries, obviously the three-year blockade with Qatar was of great concern to Western allies. But in terms of Qatar, I mean, did you just completely unpack all of that?
No, not at all. No, and I do want to say that we didn't see it as a blockade. I think that's an outsider's term. The way we see it is that we decided to withdraw cooperation from Qatar because we disagreed with their fundamental approach to the region. And
So now they're going to have a different approach to the region.
We are giving them the benefit of the doubt, particularly the Emirates. We are giving them the benefit of the doubt. There is little,
Because Al Jazeera is still on the air.
It is on the air, absolutely. And one would hope that they would tone down the kinds of rhetoric that they were very used to promulgating. Which should actually be of concern to Western states as well. We can talk about what Al Jazeera does in English and what it does in Arabic and the way in which they have. With all due respect to journalists, there's a set of journalists who have a vested interest in the continuation of a particular institution. Will Al Jazeera be watched if it isn't as vitriolic as it is? Difficult to say. Will Qatar's motivations, will its tactics and strategies change? We hope so. We really hope so. We're following Saudi Arabia's lead on this, and we've put our trust, as you know, in Saudi Arabia's negotiation with the Qataris, and so we're going to give them the benefit of the doubt, but it's not going to be rosy straight away. There's got to be a lot of confidence building measures, and we'll see how it goes.
You talked about following Saudi Arabia's lead on this one.
Yeah.
Obviously, Saudi Arabia, the largest economy in the region, and in many ways has been, in the last 100 years or so, the leader of the Gulf Arab countries. But the last few years have seen a different narrative emerge, obviously with the United States and the United Arab Emirates, very, very close ties and alignment on so many issues, including, for example, the Abraham Accords. Do you still believe that Saudi Arabia is the leader, really, of this region?
Absolutely. There's no doubt. Saudi Arabia is a large. It is the largest Gulf country. It's the largest country that comes from the same origins that we do. We will always look up to them as the older brother, as the leader of the region. And we in those terms, what we do is we speak to leadership in Saudi Arabia. We give them our view of the world, and we will have a slightly different view, but it informs debate, it informs direction, and it's vital that we continue to do that.
But there are disagreements from time to time, one of which, of course, is the decision by the UAE to move forward with the Abraham Accords. Do you believe that the older brother in Saudi Arabia will eventually come on board?
That's a question for them to answer. We have demonstrated what is possible.
And it didn't stop you?
Well, no, it didn't stop us because we believed that this was of fundamental interest to the United Arab Emirates. And we're still a sovereign country. We still see Saudi Arabia as the leader, but that doesn't mean that we have abdicated our decision-making power to them. There are certain things that are vital. And in a sense, we are able to lead in certain ways. Lead by example and demonstrate, again, with Israel what is possible. So in that sense, we're very happy with what we've done.
How concerned are you today with Russia and their role in the region? Because obviously they've made a lot of strides in terms of economic diplomacy. They're now working with OPEC very, very closely to stabilize energy markets, which is, of course, a great concern to the UAE, among others. How do you see Russia's role today in the region?
I think we deal with Russia as a small state deals with a large state. We are not going to get into their internal politics. We will try to understand how decisions are made. We will try to understand, perhaps how they perceive their place in the world. And I think we've made certain kind of strides in that sphere. I think what the Emirates managed to do over the last sort of 10, 15 years was to establish working relationships with some key Russians and key Russian institutions, which allowed us to then be able to have discussions about Russian involvement in the region. Now, in 2008, 2009, when I first got to Moscow, nobody really expected Russia to be deploying troops and weaponry in different kind of theaters. Then Syria came along, and then now it's Libya. But also you have to take into account that the Russians have very good relations historically with a number of Arab countries and with Iran. So it's important for us to continue to keep that door open. If it means that we understand better the actions of local players because our Russian friends are able to tell us what's going on, then that's something that we really need to take advantage of. So what we don't like doing, I think, in the Emirates is we don't like closing doors on people on the basis of some kind of ideological disagreement. We understand that perhaps the Russians have engaged in manipulation of perceptions in the United States or Western Europe, but nevertheless, we still need to work with them.
When you think about this with regards to the bigger picture with the region, so Russian influence in the Middle East, Western European influence in the region, and the United States, thinking back 19th century, early 20th century, the Great Game was about territorial integrity, right? That moved then further into energy markets. It was about who controlled the resources. Today, in so many ways, it's about who controls technology, who controls data. How do you see the Great Game today in this part of the world?
Look at the Eastern Mediterranean. It's still about, and Libya, it's still about resources. Technology is a very interesting thing because I think what we have come to understand is if you want to make decisions, you need access to technology. You need to maybe even own the technology or develop the technology. And although the world is an open marketplace, there are still certain restrictions. I think in the Emirates we've taken a very studied approach to this question. We've understood that our degrees of freedom of action are related to what we produce internally here, both intellectually in terms of strategies, but also in terms of manufactured products. What is it that we can? How do we arm ourselves, essentially, right? And very often, outsiders have looked at us as a marketplace for weaponry. Sovereignty is related to military production. And I think that, to an extent, we're interested in doing that, and we're interested in cybersecurity, and we're interested in artificial intelligence. All of these things that allow us to consolidate our position in the region, but also, if necessary, to project our views across the region.
COVID-19, when we think about what happens next with regards to coronavirus, something that's upended the global economy. Obviously, the UAE has been at the forefront of vaccinations. You're now number 2 in the world, right behind Israel. How do you think that this is going to impact the UAE's ability, not just to do business in the world, but also in terms of exerting that kind of diplomacy? Because if you talk to anybody in the United States, in Europe, in Asia, the only place in the world that seems open today is the UAE.
Yeah, it's an interesting question we ask ourselves as well. And between the Emirates, each individual Emirate has a slightly different approach to how it manages the problem, partly because they have different kind of demographic structures as well. We have fairly strict guidelines on mask wearing. It's not a politicized issue, it's a simple health issue. Put your mask on. And we've implemented all of the kinds of rules that you need in restaurants to keep people socially distanced. I know that the leadership in the UAE very, very quickly picked up on the danger. I think it was in January of last year. They picked up on the danger that the virus represented and quickly set up the infrastructure to begin to deal with it. So doing deals with different pharmaceuticals without knowing in advance who was actually going to come up with a vaccine. And then, providing the UAE as a place where vaccine trials could take place. All of this was essentially very forward-thinking, very fast-thinking, and I think it put us ahead of the curve. And now what we're trying to do is we're trying to vaccinate the population up to 50%. in order to then hopefully herd immunity kick in. So I think we internally here are very pleased with the progress we've made. Obviously, there are people who are still getting sick and unfortunately passing away. But overall, we think that we've managed to find the balance between health and safety on the one hand, and economic kind of viability on the other hand. And it's really balancing personal responsibility with an economy that needs to go forward. So essentially we tell people, look, it's no secret what you need to do to avoid COVID, to keep yourself healthy. If you're not willing to do that, well, you genuinely have to take your own kind of responsibility for that. We've also got the hospitals in place, we've got the ventilators in place, and I think in that sense, we're not near being overwhelmed as some other countries have been.
It's interesting because obviously Israel is number one in the world at the moment in terms of vaccinations, but one of the areas in which they have failed so far is a plan to vaccinate the Palestinians. And obviously in your relationship with them via the Abraham Accords, you do have significant influence, I think, at least in terms of conversations.
Yeah.
Are you encouraging Israel to make a push to vaccinate their entire population, as well as the Palestinians?
I'm not privy to those discussions. I'm sure we would be, of course, in favor of that, and I wouldn't be surprised if we had been saying something about that. I'm not sure myself of the local politics, the local kind of health politics involved. So, I probably don't have much to say there.
When you think about that with regards to the broader picture of the Abraham Accords, there have been a lot of criticism, obviously, that this doesn't do enough to help the Palestinians. And the answer to that from the Kushner and Trump White House was essentially, if they want to partake in this, then they can.
Right.
It's their leadership that's holding them back. Do you believe that to be the case?
I don't think it's a secret that we've had problems with Palestinian leadership for some time. But encouraging signs. They've decided to go for elections, although they've sort of prevented certain individuals from running for those elections. But the changes in the air. Perhaps they'll move forward. I'm looking forward to. We always encourage them to engage with the Israelis, and we always encourage the Israelis also to engage with the Palestinians. But again, in a sense, we have put ourselves first as a state, and we're looking towards our own national interest. And but this is something again that the Palestinians may not have picked up on over the last sort of 2 decades: the changing economies of the Gulf and the changing demographics of the Gulf. We need to take care of our people's aspirations. We need to provide them with economic opportunity. We need to provide them with safety and stability. And we're going to do whatever we need to do in order to make sure that happens.
Is there a role that you believe that the Gulf countries, and the UAE in particular, should be playing at this point in Lebanon? Because it's an issue of regional stability. It's an issue of the rise of Hezbollah, which is, of course, a U.S. designated terror organization.
Sure, yeah.
And now in your new relationship with Israel, it's essentially a failed state on their border. Is there a role that the UAE plans to play in trying to make that a better place?
I think we all have a love for Lebanon, and we've all in the past tried. And perhaps just as the Palestinians needed to rethink their relationship with the Gulf states and the Emirates in particular, the Lebanese might have to do the same. It isn't business as usual. It isn't sort of large sums of money being splashed about in order to calm things. They have fundamental problems, and we at this stage I don't think we have anything to contribute, to be honest.
Your Excellency, thank you so much for joining CNBC.
Thank you.
That wraps up my exclusive interview with the UAE's Assistant Minister for Culture and Public Diplomacy, Omar Saif Ghobash. I'm Hadley Gamble in Abu Dhabi. Thanks for watching.